Thank you very much, Sandro, and thanks to GSA for inviting me today to talk about something a little bit different than what has gone on earlier in the day. And like everyone else here, I've been fascinated by the conversations and all of the disruptive trends that we're talking about today, whether it is with respect to AI or moving design to the cloud. What I'm going to talk about today is a bit of a change. I'm going to talk about the state of relations between the US and China. And while we live in a world of great flux today, Brexit, rise of nationalism, right wing parties throughout the world, I would posit that there is no single relationship in the world that will be more important to everyone in this room, to the entire semiconductor industry, and to the future of the 21st century than that between the US and China. And unfortunately, today, the two countries look like they're on a collision course. And I think it's important to note that this is not something that has happened magically overnight. This is a development that has really escalated over the course of the last few years as a result of both sides, the US as well as China, actions and leaders on both sides of the globe. But I will note that over the course of the last year, these tensions have dramatically escalated. And as you can see from the range of activities beginning in the summer of 2017 to the present today, we have seen a significant ramping up of tensions between both countries on matters initially relating to trade, but ultimately and more fundamentally relating to technology and national security. And so I think you'll see that this is something that needs to be managed very closely, not only between the US and China, but this is something that today everyone here in Europe will also have a very important role with respect to how this dialogue or this relationship ultimately resolves. So to put this in some historical context, there's been a lot of talk over the last 2 years about the so-called Thucydides trap. This is something coined by Graham Allison, a professor at Harvard, who wrote a very influential book about the nature of conflict between great powers. Thucydides was a Greek historian who lived about 2,400 years ago. And he basically posited that the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens was to some extent inevitable. And one of the most famous quotes in that is that what made war inevitable was the rise and emerging Athenian power instilled great fear in Sparta. And he's taken that approach and that model and applied it to other scenarios throughout history. And you see this on the slide here, where we can take it very close even into the 20th century, where there were two great wars fought over potentially some of these constraints that have evolved when you had an emerging power and an established power. Clearly today, the relationship is between that of the US as the dominant established power and China as a potentially rising power. So how did we actually get here? And is this really something that we could characterize as a Cold War, similar to what happened between the US and the Soviet Union for much of the 20th century? Well, I think several things have changed. Of course, we can talk first about the US side, which is you do have today a administration that is clearly much more nationalistic and clearly views trade and national security as a more unilateral proposition versus supporting the broader, I would call the global post-World War II era of multilateralism. But on the China side, there's also been some very important developments as well. And I think this is why there's a view that there is a potential Cold War level relationship to the extent that the US and China may be competing on various levels. And the first is certainly on ideology. As we all know, China has a very different political system than that which exists both today in the US and in Western Europe. And that system has continued to evolve further away from what initially the Western economies expected would happen with China, which was that China would gradually become wealthier and prosperous, which it certainly has become wealthier and more prosperous. But the other expectation was that China would become more democratic as well. And certainly that part of the equation has moved in the opposite direction. And today, the ideology potentially that China offers other countries is one of combining market economics with a potentially one-party state. And that is also being seen itself through economic spheres of influence. And this is today in Europe, we are at the heart of some of this battle between One Belt and One Road. And what we've seen in the last few weeks, even with Italy signing up for the One Belt, One Road, with Greece also as one of the core Western Bloc EU members also signing up for One Belt, One Road. And these are trends that are clearly alarming to the US with respect to influence. And Mike Pence, the Vice President of the US last fall, made a very controversial speech about going after One Belt, One Road and how they viewed it as a means for China to create debt traps to basically have countries be under their economic influence. And I think combined with that, you're also seeing a much more assertive China on the military side. We all know that China has spent significantly greater amounts in military as a percentage of GDP, albeit still far, far, far lower than what the US spends today on military. But importantly, you've seen China assert itself in ways that would have been unheard of perhaps a decade ago, namely with some of the actions in the South China Seas, the bases that were set up there, as well as relationships with North Korea. Certainly, you're also seeing this with ongoing tensions with Taiwan. And then on the last point, and this is perhaps the most important point, not just for all of us here because of the semiconductor industry, but because to a large extent, the fundamental tension is going to be about technology going forward. And is there a way that the development of technology such as AI and 5G does not become balkanized? There was a discussion about an internet for all countries or different countries. It's more likely that, given the nature of the internet, that it could be heavily influenced by a US or a China-led type of sphere of influence. So if you look at sphere of influence today in terms of the economics and the military side, you're clearly seeing emergence of institutions that are supportive of a China-led world order or a China-influenced order. And that's clearly a reflection of China's desire to express more of its capabilities on the global stage. And so in addition to One Belt, One Road, you've also seen the development of the Shanghai Cooperation Council, which includes various other countries in Asia, and also importantly, the Asia Infrastructure Bank, which was set up ostensibly as a counterweight to the World Bank, which historically has been dominated by the United States. And so with respect to these, you're going to see a White House in the US that is increasingly pushing back against China. And so today, the White House is now, in terms of its foreign policy, particularly as relates to China, dominated by so-called China hawks. And you have at the very top Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State. But importantly, on trade and other issues that influence how the current president thinks about China, both Robert Lighthizer and Peter Navarro have significant influence in the trade policy. And they have effectively sidelined or moved to somewhat the sideline Stephen Mnuchin, who is viewed as much more of a pragmatist. Lighthizer, as many people here may know, was a former US trade representative who was very involved in steel negotiations with respect to US companies in China and has a fundamentally very cynical view about China and its ability to honor its trade promises. Navarro is potentially even more extreme. He wrote a book called Death by China, and in many respects is viewed as simply wanting to hurt or harm China from an economic growth development perspective. Interestingly, on the Chinese side, you have much more of a set of pragmatists. And in China today, the leadership has gone out of its way to not be too overtly confrontational with the US, and those channels of negotiation continue. And so we see that with respect to the trade war that's going on today. But even with respect to the trade war, the US goals are actually not very clear. There's goals that to some extent conflict with each other. And that I think that also reflects the unsettled state of US policy toward China and the fact that the trade war as it's implemented today primarily via tariffs is actually hurting both the US and China from a trade perspective. And that's obviously providing a lot more pressure for the White House right now to come up with a short-term solution. And so you'll see right now that from an agricultural perspective, for example, states that are very, very important to President Trump, there is significant angst about getting and reaching a trade accord very quickly. And the agriculture lobby in the US has been quite vocal about that. And so the current view today is that from a trade perspective, there may be a face-saving trade agreement that may solve something near term on the tariff side. Certainly, that's one of the main reasons that the stock market has run up so much this year. From a Wall Street perspective, that's the view. The issue, I think, remains though that fundamentally trade is a superficial issue because ultimately China remains very focused on developing its own economic growth and self-sufficiency. So that certainly means that there's going to be a desire from the China end, as Wally pointed out in his slides today about development in the semiconductor industry. But I would point out that it's much broader than just semiconductors. If you look at the industries that China would like to develop as indigenous industries over the course of the next, well, made in China by 2025, so next 6 years, it's a very encompassing set of ambitions. And that drive, in spite of the fact that it's not receiving as much headline attention in China today, remains very core to how the Communist Party views development in China. And so that's why the view that the US and China can enter into a Cold War and the US can implement a policy of containment is probably illusory, because the US and the Soviet Union were never ever closely connected to the same extent that the US and China are. And so you see that very clearly with respect to the export and the import numbers. We certainly know here how important the semiconductor industry is, and you see that reflected in the numbers, but clearly today, from a global perspective, this impacts virtually everything we see, eat, and touch. And ultimately, for the US companies as well, that means there's going to continue to be a significant amount of reliance on China. We all know in the semi industry how important that is. Well, in Germany, we all know as well how important the auto industry is in terms of China as an end market for all of these companies. And so from that perspective, the interrelationship between both countries is going to be a very delicate one, in spite of the fact that you're seeing both sides continue to confront each other much more bluntly. So again, I think that on the trade side, that there will be a near-term resolution, perhaps a face-saving one, but the deeper issues remain quite ingrained. And that's really because ultimately the trade war is about tech supremacy. And this is where the reality of both countries' desires come very, very clearly into conflict. The emergence of AI and 5G has really heightened US sensitivities to China's economic and technological emergence. The development of China's technology today as not just a manufacturing technology, but an innovation-driven technology, and one that is actively pushing AI and 5G, is something that has not confronted the US for well over a century. And this is driving significant national security concerns, as we all see with the active campaign that the US has waged against Huawei globally, and particularly here in Europe. And so a big question out here is, if this resolution does not work itself out, is there a possibility that the world will ultimately split into different tech spheres? You could have a US-led technology sphere, and you could have a China-led technology sphere. And certainly if you look at where China is investing today, both with the One Belt, One Road, and also with respect to where some of China's larger technology companies are growing, for example, in Southeast Asia or in Africa, that remains a very real possibility, and how that ultimately gets resolved is going to be one of the most critical issues of both the semiconductor technology industry and also obviously global geopolitics. So where does Europe sit in this entire situation? It's obviously in an interesting position because on the one hand, Europe has become much more sensitive with respect to China's trade policies. As Emmanuel Macron recently said, the era of European naivete towards China is over. At the same time, Europe is heavily reliant on China as an export market. Nowhere more so, of course, than Germany here. And so you're seeing a set of tensions where certain members of the EU bloc are keen to work with China, whether you see that with Italy or with Greece, and then some of the core Euro EU members, whether it's Germany or France, becoming more reluctant to some respects. Germany this year, or over the course of the last year and a half, has instituted rules similar to the US CFIUS-related rules regulating non-EU inward investment into Europe. And that's largely targeted at some of the China acquisitions that have taken place here. But on the flip side, you have in the US a president who is increasingly focused on unilateral actions and clearly also actions targeting Europe, particularly on the auto industry. So this dynamic will also remain a very fluid influence in terms of how the ultimate geopolitics get resolved. And I think the big concern that we all have today is, for the time being, there's no desire, certainly from the China side, to create a significant rupture or a more confrontational situation. The China saying right now is, 斗而不破. So struggle with the US, fight them on issue by issue, but don't have an open break in the relationship. But we're also seeing China willing to take actions that have diplomatic consequences vis-a-vis the US, whether it is targeting European Union countries to join the One Belt, One Road, or certain actions with respect to North Korea that, or in particular Russia, that don't necessarily carry, or that they are not as concerned about the consequences from the US. And today, I think we tend to view things as okay until they're not. And the big concern is the flashpoints. They remain North Korea. They remain Taiwan. They remain other areas where you could have some flashpoints. So if you did have something significant happen between the two countries that was unplanned or unexpected, is there enough trust at the senior level to manage it in the same way that it's been managed in the past, whether it was with the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, or with respect to US spy planes being taken down in the South China Seas? That will be a big question. And I think as we go forward today in this relationship, I think we can expect a continued amount of uncertainty and turbulence. And hopefully we'll see a return of multilateral diplomacy, really ensuring that some of the stakeholders today maintain the ability for economic growth, because the downside is obviously too worrisome to think about. So with that, thank you very much for your time.